Hey guys, welcome back to Wrestle News 365. Hope everyone is doing very, very well, having a good Friday. As always, there is a ton of WWE news stories to get into today, so let's kick things off with Brock Lesnar, the Universal Champion, the former Universal Champion. Gosh, I hope not the Universal Champion, not all of that over again. The former Universal Champion, the former WWE Champion. He, as many people have expected and predicted and reported, Brock Lesnar could be set to return this coming summer at SummerSlam. Now, this past week on Monday Night Raw, Brock Lesnar was mentioned by Kofi Kingston, Drew McIntyre, and Bobby Lashley. This has led to speculation that Lesnar soon may be returning to WWE programming. Brian Alvarez of the Wrestling Observer and F4W Online noted that by having Brock Lesnar's name used prominently on WWE television, the company could be setting up his return. Now, first of all, that isn't news. You know how I feel about stuff like this. That is opinion. And don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with opinion. This is what the channel's all about. The channel's about opinion. But in that case, Brian Alvarez saying, well, that could be this, it could mean that. That doesn't mean anything. That means that opinion means just as much as my opinion, your opinion. That's looking at something and speculating on it, which is fine, but that's not news. That's not insider information. That's not sources. That's not really journalism. That's more commentary. And again, I don't have a problem on that, but that's not news. Where it does transfer into news, which is why we're going to talk about it here today, is Andrew Zarian of the Mat Men podcast, who has recently broke quite a few stories when it comes to new sets being built for Raw or SmackDown, where it comes to WWE's return to touring. He was first to report that when it comes to... And that was even to the date, by the way. He got it to the date for SmackDown. That was correct. He also broke news about Money in the Bank. So he's been on fire recently, really much so. He has confirmed that there are plans in place for Brock Lesnar's return to take place at this year's SummerSlam event. Zarian has also reported that WWE is in talks for John Cena to return at SummerSlam this year too. He stated that Brock Lesnar's return would significantly help with the sale of tickets for the show. He said, quote, "I would say expect to see all of the big names that make sense." He then further stated Lesnar was early on for SummerSlam plans, that they were trying to do something. I think the concept behind Lesnar is to justify we're going to pay him, and we need more consistent touring schedule so we can build to this, and those appearances by Lesnar would help sell tickets, obviously. Now, the reason I find this one interesting, as I mentioned before, when it comes to Brock Lesnar returning to WWE, I think most people expected, you can go back to when the reports first came that his contract had expired with WWE last year. Everyone said, especially once you start looking at it, logically, everyone said at the time, well, obviously, Brock Lesnar being on a Brock Lesnar contract, which is worth, we're talking major, major money, millions and millions and millions of dollars, one of the highest paid guys on the roster, if not the highest paid guy on the roster, for a limited amount of dates. When you're in a pandemic era, when you don't have any fans in attendance, you're not selling out arenas, you're not selling out stadiums, you can't do the big Saudi Arabia shows, so you don't get the fees from that. Brock Lesnar's contract isn't really financially viable. Brock Lesnar's biggest attraction, the reason Brock Lesnar is on that amount of money and he's on that amount of wage and he's got such a big fee and such a limited amount of appearances because Brock Lesnar sells tickets. He's a box office attraction. The issue there is that there hasn't been a box office in the past 18 months or so because there hasn't been a situation where WWE's been trying to sell tickets or anything like that. So Brock Lesnar's wage wasn't financially viable over the course of the last year or so. So it didn't make any sense for Brock Lesnar to be under contract with WWE. Had the pandemic not happened, Brock Lesnar would have never left WWE television. His contract would have never expired. Yes, his contract has expired before, but he would have been back very, very, very quickly. We're talking about Brock Lesnar's appearance being over a year ago at this point, his last appearance, right? It was at WrestleMania 36, Night 2. Lost to Drew McIntyre in about 4 minutes. After that, we have seen nothing of Brock Lesnar. His contract expired. Yes, there were people saying, does this mean he's going to go to AEW, all that kind of stuff? I don't really think that was ever really a question because, as I mentioned before, Brock Lesnar's loyalty, for whatever reason, is to WWE and Vince McMahon. If he's going to wrestle anywhere, it's going to be there. He's a businessman. It all comes down to money for Brock Lesnar. Yes, he enjoys pro wrestling. Yes, he likes pro wrestling. He maybe even loves pro wrestling. We don't know. But he is a businessman at the end of the day. Brock Lesnar's got more than enough money to sit on for a while. And I think being in Canada, being a recluse like he is, he probably thought, you know what? I'm eventually going to go back to WWE. Everyone knows I'm going to go back to WWE eventually. Vince McMahon knows, I know, Paul Heyman knows, whoever needs to know knows that I'm going to go back eventually. I'm going to sit out the pandemic, however long it may be, and I'll get paid eventually because they'll want me back. Because the moment that WWE goes back to touring, the moment that WWE needs to sell tickets once again, they'll pick up the phone and call me and say, Brock, can you make this date? Can you make this date? Let's work out a deal. So I don't find this news very surprising at all, frankly. I think most people don't find it surprising. The only interesting element of this right now is that WWE, over the course of the last couple of months, when it comes to the budget cuts, whatever the budget is, and we'll touch on this in a second, whatever budget they're cutting, they are just ripping apart. But you've got all of these talents being released by WWE in April, this past week. Big name talents on big contracts. It's not just the talent as well. It's the corporate staff at WWE headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, around the world, in Los Angeles, India, the United Kingdom, Japan, wherever. All of these employees and independent contractors are being let go by WWE as part of budget cuts, cost-cutting measures. Again, what budgets they are trying to cut, we don't know. But at a time where WWE is trying to save all of this money to make themselves more profitable than ever, to drive revenue higher than ever, and tell their stakeholders and stockholders that they are more profitable than they have ever been, at a time they're getting rid of all of this talent, specifically people like Braun Strowman, who was a big player in WWE, a main event player, a former Universal Champion, had about 1 million matches against Brock Lesnar, in which he lost pretty much every single one of them. A big guy like that gets released because he's on a contract that's too big in the eyes of WWE. At the same time, WWE is negotiating a contract with Brock Lesnar that is going to be astronomical. Irrespective of being in the pandemic or not, a Brock Lesnar contract is a massive, massive contract. It's a huge investment. The difference between Braun Strowman and Brock Lesnar obviously is in the eyes of WWE. Brock Lesnar's contract, once again, is financially viable now. It's worth the money they're going to spend, which is fascinating, because if I'm a released talent, again, I'm not saying Braun Strowman is a bigger box office draw than Brock Lesnar, because he's not, but if I'm a talent and I'm hearing the reason that I'm being let go, or if I'm an employee in the company that worked in WWE headquarters, in WWE Digital, WWE Studios, that I worked so hard on over the course of however long I was there for, if I'm being let go and I'm told, well, budget cuts, sorry, we've got to save some money here, and then at the same time, you're negotiating a contract which will be worth, for, again, millions and millions of dollars. I'm looking at that going, wait a minute, that's not really fair. And maybe business isn't fair. Maybe life isn't fair. It isn't. But I just find it interesting, and I know people will jump to those kind of conclusions. Obviously, don't get me wrong, Brock Lesnar is a box office draw, and WWE is going back to a point where they need to sell tickets. And just because they haven't had shows where they've been selling tickets for the course of the last 18 months or so, that doesn't mean just because they're going back, tickets are going to be sold out like that. Maybe for the initial shows, yeah, of course, people will be excited for those initial Raws and SmackDowns and Money in the Bank and SummerSlam. Probably won't be an issue. But those shows a couple months in, once we're still in the pandemic, which we still are, and times still are tough and times still are tight, and people have less money in the pocket than they had previously, you've got to come up with a good reason to buy a ticket to a WWE show. Maybe they think Brock Lesnar is that reason. I don't know if that's the accurate answer or not. WWE obviously thinks it's a worthwhile investment. Only time will tell. But I find that fascinating. Not surprising, but I find it fascinating considering what we've seen over the course of the last couple of months when it comes to budget cuts. So that's certainly interesting. Now, what I did want to talk about as well is this text message. Now, obviously, we spoke about those releases this past week, and the WWE roster was told that Wednesday's talent releases were made due to budget cuts. Again, this is what I really wanted to talk about. Now, as mentioned previously, WWE Talent Relations head John Laurinaitis texted the entire Raw and SmackDown roster on Wednesday to inform them of the WWE releases made earlier in the day. This included Braun Strowman, Aleister Black, Lana, Buddy Murphy, Santana Garrett, and Ruby Riott. Now, in an update on this, PW Insider has obtained the full text message that John Laurinaitis sent to the remaining Raw and SmackDown superstars that night. The full text message reads like this. Don't expect anything big because it's pretty succinct. This is what the text message says, quote, "Due to budget cuts, the following talent were released today. Braun Strowman, Lana, Buddy Murphy, Santana Garrett, Ruby Riott, and Aleister Black. John Laurinaitis." So, yours sincerely, John Laurinaitis. Well, I find it interesting. Now, it was previously noted on the Wrestling Observer radio show that this may have been the first time that the rest of the roster have received a text message about other wrestlers being released. I would love to know, because feels... And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to blame John Laurinaitis for this, because being the head of talent relations is such a difficult job, and it's an awful position to be in, frankly. It's the heat position. JR would say about this for years, and John Laurinaitis, for all of his faults and for all of the people that don't like him, it's most likely it's because, and maybe it's different on some occasions, but most of the time people don't like John Laurinaitis because he was the head of talent relations. And when you're the head of talent relations, most of the time you're dealing with talent problems. Yes, you're coordinating other things, and yes, you're trying to get people to TVs and to live events and all this kind of stuff, but most of the time you're dealing with talent issues. And a lot of the time that can be releasing talent. You've got to make the phone call. Sorry, we don't have any plans for you, or budget cuts, we're going to let you go. That's a heat position. You have to call them up sometimes. You're being fined. You're being suspended. It's a heat position. So I don't necessarily blame John Laurinaitis for that. Certainly we've heard the horror stories over the years from the likes of Jim Cornette or other talents that were released. That's irrespective of it. I think what's just bizarre at this point, and interesting, but certainly bizarre at this point, is budget cuts. What budget cuts are they? That's the real interesting thing. If I was a talent that had been released over the course of the last couple of months, I would be fascinated to know if they ask, okay, fine, I get it, it's business at the end of the day, I've been let go, look, it happens. I'm certainly not the first, and I certainly won't be the last. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Out of curiosity, what budgets are being cut? Because we're constantly told budget cuts, yet every time WWE has an investor meeting or one of their quarterly calls, stockholder calls, whatever you want to call them, they tell everyone, we're more profitable than ever. Record revenues, record profits. So certainly someone's got to go, well, wait a minute. It's pretty conflicting messages here. On one side, you're telling me that we have to have budget cuts which come every year, by the way, every year. Budget cuts, sorry about that, pal. Budgets are being cut. What budgets? What budgets are being cut? If you said, well, we're cutting the talent budget, we want to have less people under contract on the roster, you'd go, okay, I understand that. That's business. Or if you say, if you're an employee and you go, look, budgets are being cut because we're going to merge departments together. For whatever reason, we think we've got too many people working in all of these departments. We want to streamline things. We want to become more profitable. You'd go, okay, well, you can't argue with that. That's business. But budget cuts just seems like a cop-out, doesn't it? It's the new creative doesn't have anything for you. Budget cuts, unfortunately. And also, it kind of moves the heat, doesn't it? Because when they say creative doesn't have anything for you, that puts all of the heat on the creative team or the creative writers or the head of creative. Heaven forbid creative can't come up with anything for you, or creative can't be creative for your character. Heaven forbid anything like that. So now, budget cuts is this kind of mystery, vague thing because no one's really in charge of budgets, right? Apart from Vince McMahon or Nick Khan. But they're not going to go, Nick Khan wants to make us more profitable. See ya. Boom. That's not going to happen. So they just go budget cuts. Corporate speak. What? Who's cut the budgets? Oh, the almighty budget gods have cut the budget. Again. Cut every single year, to the point where you're going to have one person just doing everything in WWE Digital. Who does the graphics? Oh, that's the same guy that does the promos. That's the same guy that does the video packages, all that kind of stuff. Why? Budget cuts. And by the way, we're more profitable and we have more revenue than ever. So I find that interesting. I find it interesting as well that the talent were informed about this in a text message on Wednesday nights, even though that's, the news broke Wednesday early on. Who wouldn't know about it? So again, I find that very interesting. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to see how that whole scenario works inside WWE, isn't it? Very interesting. Now, speaking of these releases, it looks like WWE are trying to restock and replenish their roster at the same time because of these releases from Raw and SmackDown over the course of the last couple of months. Now, this is a report from Fightful Select, which, of course, is Fightful's Patreon service. Be sure to check that out. I did a big spiel yesterday about how great Sean Ross Sapp and Fightful have been right now. For me, he's the number one guy, especially over the course of the last couple of months or so. Just everything has just been bang, bang, bang. Not only first, because, first obviously sometimes is important, but for me, the most important thing is accuracy, and he's accurate every single time. Not only is he first, but he just does good journalism. And I think it's so disappointing that the bar in terms of wrestling journalism is to just do good journalism, but that's where we are. There are so many charlatans coming up with just random stuff, throw enough stuff at the wall and maybe something will stick and say, see, I have sources that aren't just the mirror in my room that I talk to every single time. Nevertheless, Sean Ross Sapp, Fightful, doing an excellent, excellent job, so be sure to check them out. Fightful Select did a report yesterday saying that WWE are looking to reload the main roster after their releases. Fightful reported recently that they had heard of several call-ups on the horizon and that WWE officials were at the WWE Performance Center taking in Performance Center Live matches on Thursday. That was yesterday. Performance Center Live are in-house events and were informed that Bruce Pritchard, Canyon Ceman, Johnny Ace, Jamie Noble, and Matt Bloom were all taking in practice matches at the actual event on Thursday. So it would appear after these releases, the senior bigwigs, certainly on the creative side of things, took a chance to be at the Performance Center yesterday and look at which names they want to have become regular characters on Raw or SmackDown. Again, that's not a massive surprise. Considering the releases, you look at SmackDown. SmackDown tonight's going to be fascinating because the SmackDown roster is decimated. I mean, there aren't many people on that SmackDown roster right now. They'll have no issue putting a show on, obviously, tonight, but they need names. And Monday Night Raw needs names because the show is awful. They need fresh names. They need fresh storylines. They need fresh baby faces to face Bobby Lashley. That show's just a mess. So I would expect a lot of names to be called up, and I think we would have expected that anyway, frankly. As I mentioned, with the return to touring and with the return of live fans on the horizon, WWE is planning just a big refresh, I think, in general, when it comes to, okay, let's just freshen things up. We know new sets are coming, probably new graphics, probably new theme songs, new everything. They're trying just to start over, literally by removing all of the talent from the company as well, but they're trying to start over. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get these call-ups coming soon. I think it makes sense that would be their next plan. So that's certainly interesting too. Braun Strowman, I really want to talk about this one because I read this earlier and it kind of... It bothered me. I must say it bothered me because Dave Meltzer has spoken about some details regarding Braun Strowman's departure from the company. Now, it had been previously reported that Braun Strowman's big money contract was a real big reason for his departure from WWE. Now, that report has been backed up and confirmed by Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. He has stated that Strowman's contract did, in fact, play a part in his departure. Meltzer revealed that the Monster Among Men was on a $1.2 million guaranteed deal per year, easy for me to say. He also stated, this is where it bothered me, he also stated that the arrival of giants such as Omos, Aziz, and Shanky meant that Braun Strowman had become, quote, obsolete. Meltzer embracing Matt Hardy there. The report also stated that he made a huge mistake, he being Strowman, while he negotiated his contract in 2019, which resulted in him getting fired. This is what the report has to say, and again, I just... With Strowman, Adam Shear, 37, who was on a $1.2 million guaranteed deal and had just a few weeks back denigrated all non-WWE wrestling and said he would never work anywhere else, the decision was made because of the feeling he was 2 years past his peak and he had become obsolete as the roster giant because of Omos on Raw, Commander Aziz on SmackDown, and perhaps Shanky on Raw being the main reason, being the main roster who were also so much bigger than he was. Wow. I mean, where do you start with that? Now, I don't mean this to be a whole, I'm going to bury Meltzer or all this kind of stuff. I really don't. I truly don't mean that to be a whole, I'm going to bury Meltzer or anything like that because, you know, he's Dave Meltzer at the end of the day. But frankly, the idea that Braun Strowman at 37 years of age was deemed past his peak, I find is laughable. 2 years past his peak, so he's in his peak at 35 years of age. If that's the case, you gave him a contract whilst you know he was going off his peak because 2 years ago he got his big contract, 2019. So you knew, if you were WWE, you knew that at 35 years of age, right, he's at his peak right now. We're going to give him this big contract. 2 years later, oh, he's past his peak. Bad business in general. The idea as well that two new big giants on the main roster, Omos on Raw, who we have barely seen in in-ring action, by the way, and is being heavily protected in terms of in-ring action because he's obviously green. There's no doubt about that. The presentation of Omos is great, and I think the little that he has done has been great. WWE are pretty good at presenting a giant and making sure they hide all of his weaknesses and all that kind of stuff. They're doing a good job with Omos, but he's green. There is no way Omos is going to go out there and have a 15-20 minute match in the same way that Braun Strowman was. That's just not going to happen. Same with Commander Aziz on SmackDown. That's not going to happen. Commander Aziz, again, has been very protected so far. He's the backup for Apollo Crews. I'm not a massive fan of the gimmick, to be honest. I think the idea of, well, Apollo Crews is Nigerian, so he must have a military commander behind him. Oh, wow, that's not from the 1980s at all. What's next? He's going to put over Hulk Hogan in the main event of WrestleMania? Again, don't get me started on all that, but again, the presentation's good. The Nigerian nail, they're trying to get that over. But the idea that because Omos and Commander Aziz have recently debuted on the main roster, that Braun Strowman is no longer this viable commodity or he's obsolete, I think is ludicrous. And again, I don't know who thinks this. If that's Meltzer that thinks this, again, that's ridiculous. If that's WWE that thinks that, that's also ridiculous. Braun Strowman was in one of the main events of WrestleMania Backlash a couple of weeks ago. He was competing for the WWE Championship. How does that make him obsolete? I don't think anyone ever thought, with Omos and Commander Aziz coming on the show, that people thought, well, Braun Strowman's done. Nobody thought that. Nobody thought that. That's ridiculous. And the idea that Shanky just debuted on Monday Night Raw. Now, don't get me wrong. We don't know what Shanky can do. I think he's made, 2 appearances. He appeared at the Superstar Spectacle, which he was fine. Again, protected in that match because he's green. He's with Jinder Mahal as a backup. Again, protected because he's green. The idea that Shanky's now on Raw and Omos is on Raw, well, Braun Strowman's this obsolete giant. Braun Strowman wasn't even presented in the same vein as Omos and Shanky. He was different. He was more rounded. He could work. As someone that couldn't work for ages, he could work and he could have good matches and he did have a personality. And, again, I find that just ludicrous that as well. 37 years of age. He's 2 years past his peak. What? What? 37? The WWE champion at the moment is like 44, 45 years of age. AJ Styles is currently still doing some of the best work of his career. He's in his mid-40s. The idea that Braun Strowman at 37 years of age is 2 years past his peak, I think is laughable. And if anyone is trying to justify Braun Strowman's departure as being, well, he's 2 years past his peak and we've got other big guys on the roster, then frankly, they need to get their head out their behinds. I don't agree with everything that Braun Strowman said, especially last year about independent wrestlers. I'm not justifying that, but I just find that staggering if that's the logic behind it. I get the logic of the contracts. Again, that's debatable. I think WWE obviously looked at Strowman and felt, you know what, he's no longer worth the amount we're paying him. That's fine. That's their call. But the idea that Braun Strowman is 2 years past his prime, and because you've got Omos on Raw and Commander Aziz on SmackDown and Shanky on Raw, 3 guys that have just debuted and are still incredibly green. The idea that Braun Strowman is now obsolete on the roster because there are other big guys is laughable. It's laughable. When did they ever say that about the Big Show or anything? The Great Khali shows up, well, the Big Show's no longer viable. Kane, get rid of him. Undertaker, he's no longer a big man. Oh, there's no room for any more big men. If you've got a couple more, they're obsolete. I just find that, I find that absolutely crazy. I find that absolutely crazy. And again, I don't know if that's Meltzer. I don't know if that's the WWE perception. Either way, it's crazy. It's crazy. Now, Meltzer continued talking about his contract. He said, quote, his salary worked against him, and one person noted he made a huge mistake in negotiations because when he signed his new deal, he was considered a hot commodity, and if he pushed for it, probably could have gotten a no-cut contract that a few bigger names have. But he didn't push for it, and he probably never imagined they'd decide to cut him after signing him to such a strong long-term deal. Again, I understand the idea that maybe he should have maybe gone for a no-cut contract and basically a situation of, you can't fire me, essentially. But why would he go for that? Why would he go for that in 2019? If he signed this big contract, he would have assumed, well, they're not going to get rid of me. And no one would have perceived and foresaw the pandemic. Nobody would have foreseen these budget cuts once again. The idea that Braun Strowman made a mistake by getting himself a good deal. What kind of business is that? Seriously, what kind of business is that? Oh, he made a massive mistake. He made himself a ton of money. What? You would think in any contract negotiations, know your worth, get the best deal possible. You would always say that. If he came out of that contract negotiations with a crappy deal, people would say, what a bad businessman. Oh, terrible businessman. He's such a bad businessman that he got a really good deal and didn't predict a pandemic coming. Seriously. And what kind of report is that? I made a bad deal. He made himself loads of money and didn't predict, the worst pandemic in 100 years. Come on. I mean, seriously, come on. What kind of rationales are people using here? That to me is crazy. It's crazy that people would look at it that way. Absolutely crazy. I mean, it really is. Now, there are rumors possibly of more WWE releases to come. Andrew Zarian of Matman, he has said that WWE releases, more WWE releases are coming. These cuts will become, quotes, a regular thing because WWE realizes the roster got bloated over the course of the last few years. I enjoy the fact that they say the roster is bloated, not the fact that the reason it's bloated. The reason the roster is bloated, by the way, is because WWE decided to start hoarding talent in 2019. In reality, that's what we're looking at here. WWE decided in 2019 that they didn't want AEW to succeed, and they had all of this money from Fox, NBC Universal, Saudi Arabia, you name it, all of these big deals that they signed for SmackDown, Raw, the pay-per-views in the Middle East, all that kind of stuff. They had all of this money at their disposal, which they didn't have previously. They had this big competitor emerging on the horizon in AEW, and they were terrified this could be the new WCW, or it could actually damage their revenue and their profits. So they decided, you know what, we're just going to buy everyone. We're going to keep everyone. How can a competition thrive when we own everyone? So even talents they had no interest in using, we'll give you a big contract. FTR will give you, was it something like $600,000 a year to not use you, or to dress you up in bow ties and lipstick? Or the Good Brothers, they signed up like 5-year contracts. They didn't even last a year. But they were desperate for them not to go to AEW. That was it. That's the reality of it. They just didn't want them to go to AEW. So again, the roster is bloated because WWE made it bloated. And maybe that is part of the reason behind these cuts and these budget cuts. But it's all just crazy, isn't it? It's all crazy. Let's talk about Tom Phillips. Tom Phillips has released a statement about his departure again. He officially confirmed it yesterday. And spoke about, again, that his family is better off because of the job WWE gave him. He was very thankful. He remarked, to be a commentator is to be capable of everything. And he was very, very praising, and was very nice about the likes of Triple H, Vince McMahon, Kevin Dunn, Michael Cole, all of those guys. It's a very long statement, so I won't read it fully out here, but it's certainly interesting. What I did want to talk about is he was slightly surprised about Adnan Virk replacing him. This is, again, speaking to the Sports Media podcast. Phillips commented on Virk replacing him, quote, "I was surprised. I had watched Adnan Virk for years, so when I hear Adnan Virk is coming in to be the announcer of Raw, I was like, whoa, that's a shift. At the same time, I was like, I have all the respect in the world for this guy's ability, what the job requires, what people refer to as traffic, getting from graphics to B-roll to interview. I thought he did Sports Center, which is one-way traffic, college football halftime shows. He's probably got the skills to do this. I was definitely surprised, but to hear it was Adnan Virk, I got it." Now, Phillips also noted he was surprised that Virk lasted less than 2 months in the role. He said when discussing Virk's time at the desk, "I've seen so many different people come and go at different levels, at different spots. I won't speak to what he was going through because that's his experience and I can't speak to that. But it was fast. He has so many other things that he does in conventional sports where he's so talented and he'll do just fine." I think he could probably just listen to Adnan Virk and realize why it probably didn't work out. That's very interesting. But look, guys, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on all of these WWE news stories we've spoken about today? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about WWE, AEW, Impact Wrestling, New Japan Pro Wrestling, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved with the community. Drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. It really does help us out here on YouTube, gut the rankings, and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or having come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.